Good morning. My name is Jan Bradley, President of the Norfolk Society of Arts, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the fifth lecture of our 2020-2021 series. A special thank you to Virginia Opera and the Virginia Symphony Orchestra for this wonderful production of The Barber of Seville. Our speaker today, Brandon Ruud, is the Abert Family Curator of American Art at the Milwaukee Art Museum, a position he's held since 2014. Mr. Ruud's 20-year museum career includes the Sheldon Museum of Art, University of Nebraska at Lincoln, the Joslin Art Museum in Omaha, Nebraska, where he began as an assistant curator in 1998, and the Art Institute of Chicago, where he worked for 10 years, 5 of them as assistant research curator of American art. At both Joslin and the Art Institute, his primary focus was on the reinstallation of the American collections. Brandon has organized dozens of exhibits, including Coming Away, Winslow Homer and England, 2018, at the Milwaukee Art Museum, Poetical Fire, 3 Centuries of Still Life, 2011 at the Sheldon, Apostles of Beauty, Arts and Crafts from Britain to Chicago in 2009 at the Art Institute, A Faithful and Vivid Picture, Carl Bodner's North American Prints in 2002 at the Joslin Museum. He is also the author of over 10 permanent collection and scholarly catalogs. Mr. Ruud holds a PhD in American Art from the University of Illinois, Chicago, and an MA from the Department of Art History at George Washington University. We are delighted to welcome Brandon Ruud as our speaker today.
Hello, everybody. My name is Brandon Ruud, and I am the Abert Family Curator of American Art at the Milwaukee Art Museum, and along with Corey Piper, the co-curator of the exhibition Americans in Spain, Painting and Travel, 1820 to 1920. And I want to thank you all very much for joining me today, and I want to extend a special thanks to both Susan and Jan for their invitation, and a special thanks and a hearty congratulations to my friends and colleagues at the Chrysler for their wonderful presentation of the exhibition and their successful opening. And so with that, I am going to begin my talk on Saucy Cigarreras and Sevillian barbers. As the current exhibition at the Chrysler Museum of Art, Americans in Spain, Painting and Travel 1820 to 1920 demonstrates, illustrated portfolios, photography, and travel guides played an outsized role in the locations that artists, travelers to Spain visited, the subjects that they chose, and in many cases, how they depicted those subjects. Artists in Spain relied upon a wide variety of established images and tropes in constructing their compositions, whether copying old master paintings at the Prado, whether from fantastic tales from literature, or printed images or texts in guidebooks, travelogues, and other portfolios. Spanish people, Spanish characters, and even Spanish stereotypes, too, played an outsized role in the imagination of artists and travelers to the Iberian Peninsula, especially during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Flamenco dancers, matadors, even laborers, merchants, and vendors represented to many conventional Spanish stereotypes and appealed to these artists as subjects and inspiration for their expressive, moody, and romantic canvases. In this closed artistic system, these images, whether printed or painted, and these legends and stories, operas and stage plays, even photographs and early films, in turn informed the popular impression of Spain in the public imagination. And as we'll see, in their search for authentic people to portray and stories to depict, many artists often borrowed from these images of popular culture. Now, as an early example from literature and stage, let's look at two paintings by two different artists of the same subject, examples separated by only 4 years. Mariano Fortuti's Slaughter of the Abencerrajes that you see there on the left, and French artist Georges Clarin's painting of the same theme. The story of the Abencerrajes was one widely told and retold in a variety of formats at the beginning of the 19th century. Accordingly, Boabdil, the last Nasrid king of Granada, supposedly massacred the rival Abencerrajes family in what is now known as the Hall of the Abencerrajes in the Alhambra. The executions were purportedly, according to many stories, because of romantic flirtation between two members of the clans. Although dismissed as fictitious, the story enjoyed popular retellings in novels, poems, and opera. There was first Jean-Pierre Claret de Florian's 1791 romance novel. Then in 1813, Luigi Cherubini's 3-act opera, followed in 1826 by a novel by Chateaubriand, and for American and English-speaking audiences, Washington Irving's Tales of the Alhambra. Now, created in 1874 while he was living in Morocco, Clarin's painting presents the most dramatic and fantastic view of the story. Set in a building, yes, with mudéjar ornamentation, but more in common with Italian Baroque architecture. On the other hand, Fortuny painted his canvas during a residency in Granada, and he set the scene in one of the alcoves of the Alhambra's courtyard of the Lions, which lends the fanciful scene an element of legitimacy. You see two photographs from the courtyard into the Hall of the Abencerrajes here. Now, translating the sterile and empty rooms of the Alhambra Palace, one devoid of any visitors at that moment, and the Hall of the Abencerrajes in particular into a passionate scene, Fortuny, according to one telling, made the image and thus the fountain run with blood. Now, another, albeit very different example of the exchange of ideas and images are the numerous depictions of the Spanish dancer Carmen Doset Moreno, known popularly as Carmen. Now, although accounts about the circumstances of how Sargent Chase painted their supposed dueling portraits of the dancer that you see here these accounts differ, it's largely believed that Sargent first met Carmencita in New York City in 1890 when she was performing at the Coster and Bile Music Hall on 14th Street. 10 days later, Sargent's friend, painter James Carroll Beckwith, hired her to attend a party in his studio. Beckwith, immortalized in a self-consciously Velasquean portrait by his friend Thomas Akins, later painted his own portrait of Carmencita, but only bust length and with a guitar rather than after or during a dance. Carmencita's performance at Beckwith's studio was described by one attendee as like Herodias's daughter, a reference, of course, to the seductive Salome from the New Testament story of John the Baptist, and also as like a young panther. An early film by Thomas Edison, done only 4 years after Carmencita's 1890 series of New York performances, shows the dancer in action, and you can decide if the critic's appraisal is accurate. There we go. This is one of many clips from the National Archives or the Library of Congress that you can see of Carmencita dancing, and I encourage you to view it again at your leisure. Now, according to specialists in 19th and 20th century Spanish literature and visual culture, Joe Lavallée, in the photographic sources and in Edison's film, the images of which are very similar, Carmencita seems to be performing a vaudevillian version of Spanish dance, one more typical of variety shows, as you see here in this photographic print of her dancing around 1890. Both Sargent and Beckwith went to see Carmencita dance again at Coster and Beale, and on March 16th, Beckwith visited Sargent's studio and found Carmencita posing for him. Sargent's great patron, Isabella Stewart Gardner, subsequently hired Carmencita for a party that was held on April 1st at the studio of William Merritt Chase. Now, Chase, in turn, himself then painted Carmencita, although she reportedly abandoned these sittings, and the artist had to make do with photographs that he scavenged supposedly off the street. Indeed, Carmencita's pose in Chase's portrait with one arm and one leg raised is that of a typical picture postcard of Spanish variety dancers. And even if we take at face value the assertion that Sargent had the living, breathing person and poor Chase had to make do with scavenged photos, it is worth noting how similar the former's portrait resembles the cabinet cards produced of the dancer during her New York performances. So, did you memorize every place and date where Carmencita performed, posed, and who painted her? If not, then good, because that's not the point, but rather to illustrate the atmosphere in which these images and texts were widely circulated and consumed and absorbed and repeated, whether in Spain or on this side of the Atlantic, as these artists continued their interest in Spanish subjects. And while I could extend this conversation to cover almost every aspect and objects featured in the exhibition, the main focus of my talk here today is on Sevillian barbers and Saucy cigarreras, and two of the most common and repeated cultural touchstones by artists and writers, Carmen and Figaro. But to explore these cross connections between art, text, theater, and how Figaro became associated with activities beyond just hairstyling, let's first take a look at Robert Henry and his attitude toward bullfighting and his depiction of the Spanish matador, Felix Asiego. And I'm not doing this simply because this painting is in the collection of the Milwaukee Art Museum, but because it does provide a fantastic example of how of all images, text, photographs, paintings connect. But also, it's a pretty fabulous painting. Now, during his 1906 visit to Spain, Henry quickly became captivated by the romanticism and the spectacle of bullfighting because he loved its pageantry. And Henry participated in almost every theatrical and mass media format in his construction of Asiego's portrait. He attended a fight in which Asiego was the matador, and he asked him to pose. Then, in preparation for painting his portrait, Henry visited Asiego right before his fight, and Henry's student, who, like many, had accompanied him on this trip, the student being Helen Niles, photographed Asiego before he entered the ring and then documented the session in Henry's studio as the matador posed in his dazzling costume. Henry started the canvas from photographs, with his goal being to suggest a moment of theater itself. The matador's grand entry to the ring when he salutes and makes a short address. And in the painting, Henry establishes that balance between an accurate and sympathetic likeness and a realistic sense of emotional drama in Asiego's awareness for the potential tragedy that awaits a matador. As Henry observed in a letter, quote, "There seems to be always a cool sort of prospect of injury which they look in the face, and the fights I have seen this time have had so many accidents, almost fatal, and otherwise that it looks like a very foolish business." In an additional 1906 letter to his parents, Henry discussed achieving the emotional and expressive objectives of performance in his portrait. "In my portrait, I think I got the sense of that look on the face I noticed particularly in Asiego. He said, when I asked him afterward, that he was always a bit nervous before the fight and that he remained so until after his first meeting with the bull's charge. After that, he feels no more." Other artists and writers in particular took this one step further, making the connection to popular culture and performance and characters from the stage even more explicit, linking the matador to the well-known comic hero Figaro. To many, Figaro, commonly known from Pierre Beaumarchais' 1784 play The Marriage of Figaro, and of course then Gioacchino Rossini's 1816 opera The Barber of Seville, represented the premier example of a comedic Spanish archetype. In his 1893 account of the country, Castilian Days, a book featuring illustrations by American artist Joseph Pennell, who is prominently featured in the exhibition, the future US Secretary of State and then diplomat John Hay wrote, quote, "The second act of the bullfight is the play of the banderilleros, the flagmen. They are beautifully dressed and superbly built, principally from Andalusia, got up precisely like Figaro in the opera. Theirs is the most delicate and graceful operation of the bullfight." Similarly, in an article on the same subject for the Century Illustrated magazine, one featuring illustrations by Robert Frederick Bloom, who also has several works in the exhibition and who we'll see again later, the author of the article, Charles Dudley Warner, echoed these sentiments. "In the second act, the chulos and banderilleros had the field. to torture and bait the noble fighter, who was getting a little weakened by his extraordinary efforts, but still seemed to think he had a chance for his life. These fellows are light and nimble, costumed exactly like Figaro in the Barbers opera, and they skip about the arena with considerable agility. Beautifully dressed and superbly built, delicate and graceful, light and nimble. These were the attributes and qualities associated with the stage protagonist, and the generic matador's costume, no matter how dazzling, provided an almost universal touchstone for how Figaro looked in the American psyche. Now contrast these accounts with a depiction by a Spanish artist, Jose Jimenez Aranda. Deeply influenced by Spanish master Mariano Fortuny, Jimenez Aranda joined Fortuny's circle of Spanish artists in Rome, where he created the painting you see here, Figaro's Shop. Even though painted shortly after Fortuny's death, Jimenez Aranda here channels his fellow Spanish artist and displays remarkable technical skills in his humorous depiction of life. In this painting, a young man strums a guitar while a priest and a couple of men in frock coats play a game of checkers. The barber, Figaro, pulls up a chair to join them. The painting is also littered with a wealth of anecdotal details, from bird cages and owls on perches, and above the door, a lavabo, a basin used for washing hands, or in this case, of course, the barber's instruments, and the one implement that in fact signals the title character's trade. One further tantalizing detail also links the painting back to the other depictions of the subject, both visual and written, that we have already seen. The scrawled graffiti of picadors and a bullfight just to the back of the prelate. Such an inclusion also unites Jimenez Aranda's painting to one by William Merritt Chase of his wife, Alice Gerson, where the graffitied figure of a bull appears just to her right, also linking the artist's depiction of his wife in Spanish dress to the larger themes of Spanishness generally, one easily understood by Western audiences who equated Spain with bullfights, matadors, and Figaro. The inclusion of the graffiti also not only links the painting back to a depiction like Jimenez Aranda's, but to Fortuny as well. Now, Chase, like many American painters of the time, was deeply enamored of Fortuny, who is credited with introducing the American painter to Spanish subjects and themes, and even in death, inspiring Chase's first visit to the country. So by the end of the 19th century, the figure of Figaro had become so entrenched in the popular imagination that simple visual references, as an illustrated page from George Parsons Lathrop's 1883 travel narrative, Spanish Vistas, could evoke and even stand in for references to Spanish culture itself. And of all the Spanish cities, it was Seville, the literary and operatic home of Figaro, that supplied the most references to the fictional character. And travel writers took every opportunity to make these creative associations. All Walter Thornberry had to do in his prosaic passage on Seville from his 1859 book, Life in Spain, for example, was passingly refer to the standard tropes to arouse such associations. He wrote, "I had thrown myself into appropriate attitudes of meditation over Columbus's grave. Afterwards, finding out that it was his son's, I had boated on the muddy Guadalquivir and had visited the Moorish palace. Charles V in moonlit armor had chaperoned me by night up the surf street. And round the site of the old mosque, Pedro the Cruel, arm in arm with the Sultan, who carried his green turban under his arm, because he had had the small misfortune to lose his head. He chatted with me in the old Alameda as we passed the shop of Figaro, or looked in at the door of Don Juan's old house. Now, the reference here to Figaro and his shop certainly conjures thoughts of Jimenez Aranda's painting of the subject. And similarly, Charles Devalier, in his extensive travelogue through Spain, with illustrations by Gustave Doré, wrote that Beaumarchais could not have chosen a happier scene for his immortal Barbier than Seville. The original of his Figaro, there can be no doubt, existed in his time in the capital of Andalusia, and is probable that one may still find him, even at the present, without much searching. And finally, it's worth noting that in his Spanish vistas, in the page that accompanies the image you see here, Lathrop himself touched on and covered almost every popular and cultural cliche associated with the city and its inhabitants, and even introduced a new one relevant to the conversation here today. Seville, he wrote, why should we not keep the proper and more euphonious form Sevilla? The home of that Don Juan on whom Byron and Mozart have shed a luster more enviable than his reputation, has been made familiar to everyone by melodious Figaro as well. And more lately, Mérimée Carmen, veiled in the music of Bizet, has brought into it the foreign consciousness again. Lathrop cloaked his references to these well-known cultural figures in their appearances in music and poetry. But there is, beyond these references, another unifying trait between both Carmen and Figaro. Both were working class laborers, and they provided another form of spectacle to the tourist gaze in Spain and in these travel guides. So, please let me briefly explain. To many travelers to the country, labor in Spain was something to be observed and enjoyed by the outsider. No matter how difficult or grueling, it was a picturesque spectacle outside of the United States' factory system. Or, as Charles Duvalier, wrote in his already referenced travel guide to the country, the most picturesque scenes abound in the lower quarters of Madrid. First come the barberos, or barbers, who shave their patrons in the open air. Then a jarrero, a jar vendor, passes laden with a number of earthen jars, beneath which he almost disappears. Further, the carboneros, or colliers, weigh sacks of coke on a sort of steel yard, using them as a counterpoise by leaning on a long pole which raises the weighing apparatus clear of the ground. Now, while many of these writers may have intended their words and images to serve as catalysts for handcrafting or a celebration of tradition or of even labor itself, they unintentionally, in the words of one scholar, constructed a Spain that was a living relic of an earlier stage of cultural evolution, naturalizing and thus perpetuating the mechanizing impulses of American industrialism. So let's look at two paintings as two distinct examples of this phenomenon. On the left, you have Samuel Coleman's Washing Day, Granada, and then on the right, Robert Frederick Bloom's Toledo water carrier. In many tourist guides, they referred to people waiting along the banks of the Darro that you see there in Coleman's Washing Day, largely in search of minute particles of gold that washed down the river. Coleman translated such romantic scenes from a bygone era into one with contemporary yet quotidian associations. Groups of women washing laundry along the banks of the river and then hanging them out to dry on nearby buildings. The picturesque nature of such scenes made them popular with American artists, particularly as they related to foreign cultures and the use of the other, from African Americans and newly arrived urban immigrants on US soil to French and Dutch peasants in Europe. Now, if women washing in streams provided one visual representation of labor, then strings of donkeys that come and go, their little backs bending under the weights of panniers and pottery, supplied another extremely popular subject, one that Bloom, in particular, milked to great advantage in his depictions of Spanish people, Spanish architecture, and courtyards. And if a genre scene of washing women could be translated to Spanish soil, or the delivery of water could transform an everyday activity into a picturesque Spanish scene, or even as we've seen, a simple reference to a corner store could inspire thoughts of the barber Figaro, then Seville's Royal Tobacco Factory did the same for the iconic figure of Carmen and for labor. Described by many tourist guides as the most commonly visited site in Spain, the Royal Tobacco Factory was a staple of travel writers throughout the 19th century and even into the early 20th. A seemingly infinite series of guidebooks and periodicals include the tobacco factory among the must-stops in their travelogues, with one writer describing it as one of the sights of Seville that no tourist misses. And these books were often accompanied by gendered and even sexualized comparisons to the famous protagonist of Georges Bizet's 1875 opera, Carmen, and of course, Prosper Mérimée 1845 novella on which the opera was based. And they were in fact, and perhaps not surprisingly, given the operatic Carmen's profession, a common and oft repeated trope in written descriptions of Spain's cigar industry. In an 1885 article for the Catholic World, for example, the anonymous writer spent several pages describing in detail the enormous barrack with its whitewashed hulls divided into colonnades that you can see here in the painting by Walter Gay, and that it was guarded by soldiers. But he made it clear from the outset that the real sight is the workwomen, referring to them as spirited hoydens, saucy cigarreras, and Carmens. In short, Bizet's popular character provided a common symbol for brazen female sexuality. But even before the debut of Bizet's opera, the cigarrera was an object of fascination and even dramatization and theater and sexualization. Jean Laurent, a French photographer who mostly worked in Spain and whose many photographs you will see in the exhibition, executed a series of images in the 1860s and 1870s that he titled Types After Nature, including a figure of the cigarrera. Posed outside the factory itself, the building's columns and arches are illuminated by sun and hidden into shadow, and the figure wears flowers in her elaborately coiffed hair, holds a fan, and is fabulously dressed. Looking toward her right, her left foot extended and just visible beneath her skirt, her pose, frankly, is somewhat hammy and meant for the stage, but not dissimilar from the examples that we've seen of Carmencita. Even the more truthful, if you will, illustrations, like the one that you see here with the English title, The Spaniards, painted by themselves, possesses similarities to many of the paintings and photographs that we've seen of Sevillian characters, including the Cigarrera and Carmencita, who, remember, was billed as the Pearl of Seville. Never mind that she was actually from Almeria, 250 miles away. Now, the tobacco factory and the city of Seville also gave artists and writers license to make specific comparisons with its most famous painter, Bartolomé Esteban Murillo, and draw general parallels between his famous ragged street urchins and tobacco workers and laborers. Images of Murillo and Seville, whether painted or printed, as in the examples you see here, cataloged and even stuffed to the very edges of the images every common reference to the city practically known, not only to Murillo, but to its architecture, its famous residents, its culture, its festivals, and, as you can see in the John Philip painting, the early career of Murillo, even its agriculture. One writer, in fact, suggested that the results of the Cigarreras' aggressive sexuality are displayed along the factory walls. Passages are lined with cradles, and the poor young girl mothers to whom they belong implore us with eyes and hands for a penny for the Murillos of the future lying in them, wrote one. Another described them as grisettishly shod. They are the Murillo women, the city Dulcineas, of course, a reference to Miguel de Cervantes's invented paradigm of female perfection from Don Quixote. And he continued, they are a sect and caste in themselves. These are women whose sires perished in the fires of the Inquisition, in the bull ring, and the Moorish battlefield. Evoking almost every action associated with the operatic heroine Carmen, the author concluded that, quote, knife, guitar, and cigar, they handle equally well. Now, as tourists clamored to visit the tobacco factory, so did artists, both American and Spanish, and their canvases are equal parts invented fantasy and pictorial record. Sevillian painter Gonzalo Bilbao Martinez painted a series of canvases of the factory, both the building's exterior and its cavernous workrooms. Martinez's depictions conform to the written descriptions of that enormous barrack with the whitewashed halls divided into the colonnades. But the real site, of course, here is the work women, who, according to one, nurse their sickly babies. Even the Sevillanas' reliance on established tropes and historical precedents is evidenced by its similarities in color, figures, spirit, and tone to Diego Velázquez's Las Hilanderas, perhaps the most well-known example of working women in Spain's old master artistic arsenal. American expatriate painter Walter Gay produced two large-scale versions of Seville's Royal Tobacco Factory 2 decades apart after he visited the country in the 1870s. Like Bilbao Martinez, the artist depicts the vast, arched, and cavernous factory where mostly young women work at row after row of tables, receding into the distance, rolling cigars. In both versions, Gay endowed the paintings with picturesque qualities. Light floods the canvases, pouring through arched windows and along colonnades. While several women work, others stop to chat, share letters, recline in boredom, or gaze upon their sleeping children cozily cradled at their feet. Contemporary accounts of the factory building match Gay's painterly rendition. Again, the interior consists of long whitewashed halls with these colonnades by rows of pillars from which spring vaulted ceilings. But as historian of the period Lou Charnon Deutsch has noted, 19th century tobacco factory workers would hardly have identified with or even recognized the activity in Gay's interpretations. Indeed, the group of women at far right that you see in one of Gay's paintings of the subject disrobe, a very unlikely activity in the openness of the workroom that was open to primarily male tourists, furthering the canvas's aura of sexual suggestiveness and providing an antidote to the modest colored shawl-clad women in the foreground. Now, the vibrant reds and rosy pinks that dot the painting lend a striking touch, and the red rose behind the ear of the foreground figure encourages associations with the doomed heroine of Bizet's opera, and thus for all Spanish women generally. For a last thought on the subject of Carmencita, it's worth briefly looking at Mary Cassatt, who spent almost the entirety of her 1872-1873 stay in Spain in the city of Seville. While I know of no blanket statements that Cassatt may have made to Carmen's and Figaro's, only to, in her own words, odd types and peculiar rich dark coloring of the models, her output during this period does show a reliance on Spanish types and other artists' prototypes. Much has been made, in fact, of Cassatt's connection to Raimondo de Madrazo y Garreta and her possible knowledge of and reference to his painting Una Gitana. Madrazo himself, an associate and student and brother-in-law of Mariano Fortuny, was in Seville during the summer of 1872, when Cassatt wrote to a friend that, "Here is Madrazo. He paints these gypsies with cheeks like some deep red peaches." And it's widely believed that Cassatt had access to and saw Madrazo's painting after his summer 1872 visit to the city. And she translated his prototypical Gitana into her own artistic statement. And if both Cassatt's and Madrazo's portraits of a traditional Sevillian look familiar, it's worthwhile to remind ourselves how similar they look to James Carroll Beckwith's portrait of Carmencita, demonstrating just how familiar and ubiquitous this kind of portrait of a Spanish type had become, whether applied to an anonymous sitter, an unknown gitana, or a famed performer. All nonetheless furthering the idea and the spirit of the Saucy Cigarrera. And I know that Chrysler Museum of Art members will enjoy an additional lecture by Betsy Boone coming up on the Mary Cassatt. So I hope you all attend that, and certainly the exhibition if you haven't had a chance to see many of the objects I'm talking about here today. And please do so when you feel safe. But I did want to end with one final example of how these images take on a life of their own even today and become associated with these mythical characters. You only need to go on social media and see one user's adoption of the handle Carmen la Cigarrera as her name. And as you see here, the use of Madrazo's traditional Sevillian image. And you can see how these popular stereotypes have endured and been embraced inside and outside of Spain. So again, thank you very much for joining me today. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope if you haven't already, have a chance to see the exhibition at the Chrysler when you feel safe. Thank you very much and take care.
Brandon, thank you for agreeing to take questions from our viewers today. Yours is a subject with a great deal of interest. Many of our members have already seen the exhibit, and I actually have a few more questions than usual. Here's the first question. Did William Merritt Chase get to meet or study with the Spanish artist he so admired, Fortuny?
Great question, and the short answer is no. And that is largely because Fortuny was dead by the time that Chase certainly visited Spain for the first time, but also by the time Chase had arrived in Italy, where the circle of Fortuny, these artists, where he had his studio, some of these other artists I mentioned in the talk, Jimenez Aranda, for example, were all situated. And it was largely through Fortuny, the access to his artwork, that Chase became inspired to visit Spain. He adopted many of the subjects that Fortuny made. You see that in the Moorish warrior in the exhibition, in the antiquary shop, but it was also largely the art press that made these associations, acknowledging Chase as picking up the mantle of Fortuny, to the extent that even a painting like the antiquary shop, though it's not a precise location, was perceived as a typical Spanish street corner. So associated with Spain and with Fortuny had these type of subjects and these type of depictions become. So no, in short, he did not have the opportunity, unfortunately, to study with Fortuny, but again, very much inspired by him in his subjects, in his style, and then inspired his first visit to the country.
Why did you choose the years 1820 to 1920 for the Americans in Spain show?
That's a great question, and it was one we really wrestled with for the catalog and for the exhibition. As I think all curators, all museums, they're formulating these things. And it was largely because we wanted to show the long 19th century, if you will, of these types of images, how different artists on different sides of the Atlantic addressed or depicted Spain or Spanish subjects. And it really starts in the second decade of the 19th century when Spain was becoming more open. They were nationalizing their collections. They were opening museums. Initially, it was the British artists, English and Scottish artists who traveled to Spain. They produced not only paintings, but many of these travel portfolios, guidebooks. These were widely disseminated. There became then an increasing interest in Spanish culture. Then you get into Washington Irving as an emissary and diplomat from the United States to Spain, the publication of his many books on the subject. And so there was just this boom and interest in Spanish art and culture beginning in 1820. And we wanted then to conclude around 1920 with the close of the First World War. This was when that first long century wave of artists from the United States who went to Spain really kind of came to an end. And then you get into subjects like the Spanish Civil War, which of course had its own artistic and literary depictions and is almost a separate subject.
What do you think it was about Spanish art and artists beyond subject matter and the novelty of tourism which interested so many non-Spanish aspiring artists to study there?
Great question. And I think a couple things. One, it really is hard to or underestimate just how influential all of these images, they played a role in inspiring people, artists in particular, to visit Spain. Again, all of these lavish portfolios, guidebooks, photographs, the paintings, everything else that was truly disseminated. As addressed in the catalog, the first use of the term tourist in Spain was at this early moment in the 1820s, 1830s. And so just really kind of launched this interest. But I think in addition to that, in short, it was Velázquez. There were waves of interest in different Spanish artists, initially Murillo in the first half of the 19th century, moving onward to Spanish artists like Sorolla or Zuluaga in the late 19th, early 20th. But by the mid-19th century, Velázquez had become so influential, had become kind of a touchstone of avant-garde art, if you will, starting with many of the French artists who traveled to Spain, who became enamored of his artwork, disseminated this to all their students, especially the American students who were visiting initially the studios of Paris, and then inspired them to travel forth and make these copies, see the things in person. And so it's really hard to underestimate tourism on the one hand, and just the importance in the American artistic psyche that Velázquez played in developing their art.
There's an interesting absence of actual bullfight paintings in this conversation. Was that not a subject that artists chose?
Yeah, really interesting. Yeah, as you saw in the presentation in the lecture, American artists were fascinated with bullfighters. You saw, of course, the Henry El Matador. There were the Mary Cassattes. You'll see these in the exhibition, and these are all moments either before or after the bullfight. This kind of psychological drama that these artists were trying to capture in their expressions. Versus the actual bullfight. And of course, then in the presentation, there were a few examples from illustrated magazines and books of the actual bullfight. And I think this is largely because there were still some reservations or controversies about actual depictions of bullfighting. You heard the words of Henry and others about, on the one hand, it being theater, a performance, it was graceful. But then at the same time, rather brutal, rather macabre. And it was probably in that regard not a suitable subject, the actual moment of the fight, beyond these more illustrated portfolios or magazine articles that could then provide context. And it's interesting, when Corey and I were doing the research for the exhibition and we were visiting Spain and looking at collections and archives, that it is not widely depicted in the country itself. And so even had some kind of cultural baggage and weight to it, interpretations within the own costume grisma or a genre tradition of that country. So no, it is absolutely right. You see these matadors and other figures depicted, but the actual bullfight itself is in limited supply in the paintings.
The cassette painting, which features in your current exhibit, are life-size, close in on the subject when almost square. Was that a typical format or character sketches?
For Cassatt in particular, was probably a typical format in that she may have ordered a standard size canvas that she used in Spain for those particular depictions, those subjects, those portraits. It would extend this also to the conversation on Henry. If you visited the exhibition and seen the Henry portraits all lined up, you will see that they are exactly the same size, 78 inches high. And this was probably a standard canvas that he ordered or became interested in for his portraits, full-length portraits at that time, and then continued on in that format a little bit before and then a little bit after. So it probably had to do with what the artists were bringing, what they had access to, and yes, to a certain extent, the format they wanted to paint, whether it was a bust length or a full-length portrait.
As a single woman, how was Mary Cassatt received in Spain by other painters and the residents?
Oh, well, I think she was treated at the time with some great interest and with some reservation. It's interesting to note that we have access to some of the letters that Cassatt wrote from Spain. So she does talk about her journey, her connections, mentioned briefly in the presentation. With other artists, Betsy Boone, who I know everyone will be hearing from later in the spring for the exhibition. We'll probably talk a bit more about this, but she did have access to collectors and collections, to other artists, again, as mentioned in the presentation. But it is interesting that there was a sense of novelty about her as an independent working female artist traveling and living alone in Spain and in Seville in particular. For example, I believe she had to take a segregated train car exclusively for women. I know that there were copying classes or open slots at the Prado that were exclusively for women, these kind of segregated studios and whatnot. So it was probably as a novelty that she was treated. But it's interesting, just one final thought on that. The last time I was in Spain, it's been almost exactly a year ago, and I was in Seville and at the Casa de Pilatos where Cassatt had her studio. And I was searching around looking at their own records, talking to people who worked there, asking them about Mary Cassatt. And the standard response was, who? Mary what? And so it's interesting to think that for us, art-loving audiences, museum goers, Mary Cassatt is famous, a household name practically. We love to go to museums and see her paintings in all their forms. And that to others, especially where she was living at the time, she was like, oh, just another artist kind of living and working here at this moment.
The Alhambra is a magic place. Which painting and painter best depicts this place?
Oh, wow. It is a magic place. Absolutely agreed. I have to say, I assume, based on the question, that the person has seen the exhibition, and I just absolutely love the Sorolla painting of the Hall of the Ambassadors, because that really is, if you think about it, the money shot, the kind of most dramatic and famous view of the Alhambra, one that really kind of captures the essence or spirit of the place. And I think the color, the light that Sorolla achieves in the painting is really magical, and it does, yeah, it really does suggest the magic of the Alhambra, just the sheer beauty of being in the place. If not an overly realistic depiction, then certainly in spirit. Yeah, that's my favorite.
Were these paintings produced to be sold to the residents or the tourist?
Oh, that's a really great question. It's kind of a little from column A, a little from column B. A lot of the photographs, the guidebooks, the portfolios that you'll see in the exhibition, these, of course, were aimed, meaning created and then marketed for specifically a tourist market. Yes, some of them were documentary. They were meant for larger commissions and things like that. But many of them were for tourists, both inside and outside of Spain. The paintings, and I think this is what's really special to me about much of the exhibition, were on the one hand personal copies by the artists. Maybe they were a copy after Ribera or Velázquez at the Prado, and they hung in the artist's studios. They provided further motivation and inspiration for other portraits, other canvases that they were depicting, and really kind of had that personal association as a memento of a visit and then as a guide for future artworks. And then in many cases, on the other hand, the paintings were done on commission, or they were done as kind of a calling card. Kind of going back to Cassatt, we knew, with the exception of the Spanish girl leaning on the windowsill, she took many of her paintings with her. They were exhibited at the Paris Salon. This became her introduction to the French Impressionists, and so then kind of kept the ball rolling. Or they were self-portraits in many cases, or a different kind of calling card to announce how fluent you were in the vocabulary of Spanish painting. And then, of course, for the art market itself, as people clamored and wanted to have paintings or artworks in their collection associated with Spain.
One final question. I understand this exhibit was to open in Milwaukee, but the museum has not reopened. Will the exhibit travel to Milwaukee after it closes at the Chrysler in May?
The answer is absolutely, and so excited that it's going to. You're absolutely right. The exhibition was meant to open last fall, in fact, in October in Milwaukee, but due to the pandemic, everything associated with it, museum closures, We had to regroup, of course, and revisit the schedule. Chrysler very graciously agreed to open a little bit earlier to accommodate a summer opening for us. And the museum will reopen the first week of March in Milwaukee, and we will open the exhibition on June 11th. And if you all feel like traveling to Milwaukee during the summer, I look forward to seeing you and taking you through the exhibition if you feel safe when it's open there.
Thank you, Brandon, for joining us today and for your very exciting lecture. I want to remind you that the Americans in Spain exhibit, which is co-curated by Corey Piper, Chrysler's Brock Curator of American Art, will be at the Chrysler until May 16th, and tickets are available through the museum's website. We look forward to our speaker for March 24th, Salvador Salort Pons, PhD Director, President, and CEO of the Detroit Institute of Arts, who will be speaking to us on the past, present, and future of the Detroit Institute of Arts. Please remember that you can always find information concerning our membership and our lectures on our website at norfolksocietyofarts.org. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you in March.